Hi everyone, my name is Ravish and I teach philosophy and literature and welcome back to yet another lecture. In this video, we are going to study Robert Frost's poem Stopping by Oaths on a Snowy Evening. Again, this is very beautiful poem and I'm going to give you multiple interpretation of this poem as always. And this is also a part of poem series where I explain poetry in depth. So if you haven't seen my other videos, then please do consider subscribing and take a look. And also you can join my Telegram channel. The link is in the description. Now let's start the poem. So there are three steps through which I will explain this poem. In the first step, I will read the poem, and second step, I will talk about how this poetry is written, and in third step, I will explain. I will give you multiple interpretations what the poem says. All right. देखो बहुत सारे videos you will find where 5 मिनट में 2 मिनट में एक complete पोइट्री की explanation दे दी जाती है बट आई एम नॉट दैट काइंड ऑफ प्रोफेसर आई एम नॉट दैट काइंड ऑफ पर्सन so what I would do is I will thoroughly explain. I will try to make you understand. I will try to make you fall in love with poetry, how poetry is written, how poetry is recited. Because poetry, reading poetry and writing poetry is one of my favorite thing, one of my most favorite thing. Anyway, let's start poem. But there is one thing I want to mention before I come to this poem is that many critics have or many scholars have read this poem as a death wish. Although this is not a death wish as far as I understand, because there's a very famous quote which he was actually annoyed, by the readers, and then he says, "All I meant was to go home for the night, and my horse was in a hurry." So you see this very beautiful statement, and he wanted to tell, or he famously said that, I do not have a death wish, and I'm not writing this poetry in a way in that way. So anyway, let's get into this poem and we will try to understand one line after the other. I'm going to read this poem and I want you to pay very close attention so that you would be able to understand this poem, how beautiful this poem is. It's very small, but it's very beautiful poem. And the poem starts with stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. Now, I want you to pay very close attention when I read it, because after this, I will explain you how this entire poem is structured and what is the frame narrative and why this particular poem is written in such a way. Next stanza is, my little horse must think it queer, but stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bell a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The next one is, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. I want you to pay close attention and note the structure, because this poetry is written in iambic tetrameter, not in iambic pentameter, which we see in Shakespearean work or in blank verse. Because here there is a 4 beat per line, which means there would be a 8 iambs. Now, I think I've already explained about iambic pentameter. So in iambic pentameter, there is a um, uh, one stressed syllable followed by the unstressed syllable. So there would be a 10 syllable. And here there would be a 8 syllable. And this is also written in a, let's say, chain rhyme, because there is an interlocking. Because I will just tell you A B A. It just rhythms A B A B B C B C C D C and D D D. So I want you to understand the significance behind writing this, because this create a feeling of forward momentum. When you read this poem, you feel some kind of connected to the next line. So there is a push. Every stanza picks up a rhyme from the previous one, and there is a push, and it pulls the reader, from one stanza to the other one. So until you reach the final stanza, where the rhyme scheme stops interlocking, and that is the end of the poem. That signifies the stop or the end of the poem. So at the end of this poem, you will see D, which means like there is no interlocking. The way we see A, B, B, C, A, B, C, B, and C, D, C. So now let's try to read the first stanza, try to understand the first stanza. Whose oats these are, I think I know. So he's affirming the property maybe, or he knows that whose woods or whose let's say these houses or these places. And then in next line he says his house is in the village though. Now the person he is talking about is the owner of the house, but the owner of the house is not here. He is in the village. So our poet, he's actually crossing through the woods, and he stopped somewhere, and here he sees a house, but that house is not his, and he's thinking about that house, he's thinking about that place. And then he says, I know, ye jo ghar jiska hai, I know this person, he's living in the village. And the next line he says, he will not see me stopping here to watch his roots fill up with snow. Now, this is very beautiful line. Here, there is a hint of guilt and anxiety you will find, because the speaker is worried about, like, being seen. He does not want to be seen. Perhaps he wants to be left alone. Maybe he wants to spend some time in nature. Perhaps he wants to, stay quieter. Perhaps he wants to be away from the, city areas. So there's a pragmatic society which is stopping. Uh, let's say he wants to stop somewhere where there is no person, or there's a contrast here as well. So I want you to imagine that when you live in a society, so you become a part of society, and the society never accepts or never consider like wasting time somewhere. Like for instance, if you have certain goals, if you want to reach from one point to point A to point B, then what you do is that you actually keep moving and moving and moving and moving. This is what society tells you. But here, this particular line is seen as if the speaker is worried about being seen, so that people will claim or people will say that this is not a place to play it. This is not a place one should stop, because this is considered a waste of time. Stopping somewhere, stopping in a woods where there is nothing, where there is no society, where there is no culture. So nature here is contrast with the society. And then to watch his woods fill up with snow. And this filling up actually implies vessel when you fill up the vessel. So when a lot of snows accumulates, it perhaps erasing the boundary of land. So which land this is, whose land is this? So in the beginning, the poem starts with whose lands or whose woods these are, I think I know. So once the snow is filled with, let's say, once the snow is filled, across the valley or across the land, nobody would be able to say that whose land is this part, whose land is this, right? So here, fill up is a kind of vessel. Okay, now let's understand the second stanza. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the wood and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. Again, very beautiful stanza. Here, I want you to pay again close attention. The first line says, my little horse must think it queer. Now, here, queer is not the word that we use today in post-colonial theory, or let's say post-structuralist theory, or let's say LGBTQ theory, but rather in gender studies, but rather this is a word which we are going to read from the context of like 1920s and 1930s or 1910, where the queer simply means strange or being illogical. So my little horse must think it queer, which means the horse, they act they are I mean, the horse here represents a contrast between the speaker and the horse himself, because horse has an instinct. Horse is someone who is habitual, someone who has a social duty. So here, uh, poet is trying to contrast with the social duty, with the social norms, with the natural responsibilities. So in nature, you don't have any responsibility. You are free from everything. But in society, you have certain things to follow. You have certain duties. You have certain responsibilities, right? And horses are trained to be trained to, to go from point A to point B. So here the horse might be thinking that it is square because it is let's say illogical to stop here because there is no shelter. And in the next line he says to stop without a farmhouse near. So there is no farmhouse, there is no place, there is no shelter. Why is he I mean, maybe he's writing from the from the perspective of the horse, but although there is a contrast between the poet uh, and the horse, because here horse represents society. Here horse represents someone who has a responsibility from reaching from point A to point B. But here poet wants to stay in isolation. And a farmhouse represents warmth, it represents safety, it represents like a commerce. Stopping where there is no shelter is a danger, is of course is a danger, or counterintuitive, we can say, because usually when we live in a society we do not like waste our time stopping somewhere in the middle of nowhere or in the middle of desert, right? And then he says between the woods and frozen lake. Now there's a wood and there's a frozen lake, and this is a liminal space, you can say, because the speaker here is caught in between spaces, like the wood and the frozen lake. So there is a wood and there is a frozen lake. Again, you see, the entire poem is a contrast. So there is always, you will always find a contrast between two different things, two different objects. The wood here, it represents myth, it represents depth, it represents the unknown, or chaos, maybe you can say. And here the frozen lake, it represents hardness, danger, and flatness. So if you see the woods, they are mysterious, they are hauntingly beautiful, right? It is unknown. And then comes the darkest evening of the year. Perhaps he's talking about the maybe because this poem was written somewhere around December 21st or 22nd, and likely he's talking about the winter, solstice. Because symbolically, if you try to understand this one, it represents the lower point of the year where there is no less possible, let's say, or we can say it's a point of depression, or it's point of exhaustion, or it's point of spiritual darkness, where you don't find anything. I think this is perhaps why many critics have said that this particular poem is actually a death wish. But of course, it is not a death wish. We do not have to read it through that lens. I will give you multiple point of view, but for now, let's try to understand. Now, let's come to the third stanza. He gives his harness bell a shake to ask it there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downflake. Again, very beautiful stanza. Now he says he gives his harness bell to shake. So the horse is wearing a bell, harness bell, and to ask if there is some mistake. Now there is a disruption of thought because the bell are hars. He's moving his head. The bell are hars, and which is man-made, of course. And the shatter, the when he says the to ask if there is some mistake, which means they shatter the silence. So in words, so whenever you go inside a forest, in deep forest, there is always a silence, some kind of silence. Of course, the wood has its own melancholy, wood has its own voices, but eventually it's a different from the city. So here, the bell is shattering the silence. And this is a kind of reminder also because the horse is effectively saying that wake up, we need to go, wake up, we need to go, because we cannot stop here. This is not our place, this is not the right place to stop because we have miles to go. Now, next stranger says the only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. Now here you see alliteration, assonance, both are used in this one. S and W sound, you will see. The only other sounds the sweep of the easy wind and downy flake. So here, sound, sweep, wind, you see, it creates a whispering kind of hypnotic effect. It's like a something is whispering with in his ear, in our poet's ear. And then it says, also it suggests the feather, softness, comfort, like a pillow or bed. And this makes the cold snow seems inviting, almost seductive. When there's a harsh winter, and you're going from one place to another, then of course you will always need some, you always want some comfort. And this is where the sentence says, the only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. So which has a kind of a whispering hypnotic sound, and someone wants you to stay somewhere, or maybe deep inside your heart you wants to stay somewhere, and you wants to stay for a while, because now you're tired, now you're so cold, है ना? So it's basically, it means that when you're so frustrated in life, when you're so sad in life, you want to stay, you want to settle somewhere, you want to stop somewhere, you want to stop thinking whatever you're thinking. So maybe it's also a point, it's also a kind of it's also a way through which we can understand that the poet wants to stay somewhere, he wants to be stable somewhere, he wants to be in isolation, he wants to be left alone in solitude, because he has seen a lot, because he has experienced a lot, because he has gone through a lot. And then the decision, the last sentence says, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, deep, keep. You see, it's like D, all the repetition sound. But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. This is the most beautiful, most poetic line you will ever read in the American literature. Here, this is a very paradoxical statement, because usually dark and deep are associated with fear. It always comes with fear. But Frost pairs them with lovely. You see, the woods are lovely, dark, and deep. So it's not associated with fear. It's not associated with something deep and dark, but it associates with loveliness, which means he is enjoying this solitude. He is enjoying this moment. He's enjoying his loneliness. Now here, there's a thin gap between loneliness and solitude. Solitude means someone who enjoys himself, enjoys his alone company, right? And also there is an allure of emotional core, because the speaker is fully seduced by the woods, he loves the wood, he is enjoying the wood so much, and he wants to escape from the promises of everyday life, his duty, his promise, maybe his promise to his wife, maybe his promise to his mother or his children. He wants to escape from all those. He wants to escape this worldly pleasure. He wants to stay somewhere in solitude. And then it says, but I have promises to keep. But then there's a whisper. This is a volta. Volta, I think I've already explained in some of my videos. Volta is basically where you change your tone. And the volta happens at the end of this poem, where he says, uh, but I have promises to keep. So he is now back in reality. So I want you to imagine that you are in somewhere in wood, and you want to stay there for a while, or maybe you have visited some place, some mesmerizing place, and then you want to stay there for a while, and you want to sit there, you want to experience that feeling, and you want to evoke all the emotions that you have, and you want to stay from all the things that happened in the wherever you work, or wherever or whatever happened with you. So so this is what's happening with our poet as well. Our poet, he wants to be left in solitude, but then he remembers, and this is where he says, but I have promises to keep. But then he remembers, he cannot run away from that, he cannot run away from his social obligations, his duty, because he has to pay bills, he has to take care of his mother, take care of his maybe daughter, his son, and so forth. And then, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Literally, this is a long physical journey, through the snow. And he wants to go home. He wants to go to his bed. He wants to, just rest, because he's so tired. So it's more like a metaphorical meaning, which is a repetition. This change meaning this entirely, because the sentence has in repetition, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep, which means he's talking about the life and death. The second sleep is basically, uh, we can interpret as a death, and this miles to go, which represents span of, let's say, time or endurance, है ना, that allows rest to die. So in a way we can say that there's a tone which is necessarily triumphant tone, and the sound is varied if you read this poem closely, and the poet is trying to force us, or force himself, to move on, despite wishing he could, he could stay in the lovely and dark forest, he could stay in loneliness. But something inside him is whispering, and he, I mean, although he wants to stay there, but something inside him whispering that, you can't stay here because you have a lot of duty to perform. So now I will give you three different interpretations of this poem. One, of course, is many critics talk about suicide death wish theory, which is quite associated with his philosophy or with his poetry. So lovely, dark, and deep, all these sentences, all these words that you read, it represents the release of death. The speaker is perhaps contemplating, ending his own life, or simply letting the cold take him. Maybe he wants to die in the wood, maybe he wants to be dead in the cold winter, or maybe because of the hypothermia, of course. And ultimately he decides that he has obligations, he has promises to keep, so he cannot stop here, he cannot die here, because he has to take care of his family. So this is one way we can interpret, because the darkest evening, frozen lake, all these things are seductive. And it says that you must stay, you must stay, but he cannot stay. And the next interpretations that you can always look for is nature versus society. Again, there's always a contrast between nature and the society, because there will always be a conflict between these two, between desire, which has wild, chaotic nature of beauty, or chaotic beauty of nature, you can say, and the requirements of the civilized and structured life altogether. So there's a contrast between civilized, structured life, between chaotic beauty or wild or nature, whatever you want to call. So you can see the honor, the honor of this poem, or of that hut, or of that house, is basically living in a village, which represents society. But the speaker, who comes from society but he's in the woods, who represents nature. So there's a domesticated horse and wild wind. So this all contrast with nature versus village or society. And again, there's another interpretations through which we can look, is the artist predicament theory. So the speaker or the poet, he is more like a, let's say, he sees everything as an art. He sees nature as an art, like staring at woods or staring at the frozen lake, which is queer and unproductive. But the artist, he wants to stay in the world of beauty, and he wants to stay in the world of imagination, because this is what the artist does. Artist always wants to stay in some kind of imaginary world, in some kind of illusion, in some kind of pleasure, in some kind of beauty, and he wants to stay there. He does not want to come out. So if you meet any painter, I have seen many painter, although I'm not a painter, I'm a sketch artist. But when I try to sketch something, I deeply immerse myself into that, and I do not want to come out from that. So this happens to every artist, every poet, every creator. And this is where the artist predicament theory comes in, because you want to stay there, but then you realized, or you're forced to come back to the necessity or the capitalist society, where you will have to take care of so many different things. So this was the poem. I think that's the only interpretation I could think of. But maybe if you have more interpretations, if you can think about more different ways, then you can write down in the comment section. If you have any questions, then you can also write down in the comment section. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. And if you did, then please do consider sharing, subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one. And do let me know on which poem should I explain more. Should I explain next?